2024 has been an absolutely incredible year for Flesh and Blood thus far, and it's not even close to over yet. 3 popular sets, the Armory Deck product line, and at the same time, organized plays on an absolute tear. However, there is one drawback. 2024 also highlighted some of the vulnerabilities within Flesh and Blood's Living Legend system. So much so that it's reasonable to question the long-term sustainability of the system as Fab's method of rotation and meta control. So in today's video, I'll explain what I mean, walk us through the problem statements, and, that's right, in true Andrew fashion, I'll back it up with real numbers and examples, and then I'll close with a recommendation of how LSS could course correct in the upcoming year. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hey there, my Flesh and Blood friends, and welcome back to Dice Commando and Go Again, a fabulous cast where we talk all things Flesh and Blood. And today I want to discuss how I believe that 2024 has pushed Flesh and Blood's Living Legend system to a breaking point, and why I believe that if we continue on this trajectory, the system may become functionally unsustainable. Now, as we go into this, I do want to be clear about 2 things. Okay, first, this is not going to be a fast one. There's a lot of moving parts here, and in order to convey both the problem statements as well as what I see as a path forward, we do need to discuss and understand the various factors and the variables. And then second, and probably the most important, is to understand that this cast comes from a place of love. Okay, I bring up something that I see as a potential problem, and I do so not from a place of taking Fab down, but rather in an effort to highlight a potential future issue. And that's why I'm simply not just outlining the problem, but also proposing some small changes that can be made to fix those problems. And also remember, this is not pro-rotation nor is it anti-rotation. I know that some folks out there feel very passionate about that in both directions, but the LL system is here and it is what it is, and we're simply looking at the mechanics of it. Since day 0, Flesh and Blood's Living Legend system has been the competitive format's primary method of rotation. Heroes earn Living Legend points for high-level event wins and accumulate those points over time, and when they cross the Living Legend threshold, 1,000 for Classic Constructed, and of course 500 for Blitz, that hero becomes no longer legal for that specific format. Now, the Living Legend system is a cumulative point system, meaning that the points never go away, and the velocity at which points are earned isn't relevant to hero legality. Once a hero hits the threshold, whether it be 6 months or 6 years, the hero will, eventually, reach Living Legend and ascend to the Halls of Fame. For today's cast, we'll be talking ideas and situations that are relevant to both Classic Constructed and Blitz. But of course, CC will remain the primary vehicle for our chat as it is a year-round effort, whereas Blitz largely comes in small bursts during the skirmish season. Now, understanding how the Living Legend system works is one thing, but keeping it in balance is another thing entirely. And keeping the system healthy is a very delicate balance between heroes added, strength of those heroes, the number, and of course density of competitive events, and ultimately, of course, the total number of Living Legend points injected. Now, as we go through today's video, I'll be referring to 3 basic concepts as it relates to the LL system: bloat, velocity, and steady state. And because we're going to be referring to these concepts quite often through this discussion, it is necessary to quickly define them to ensure that we're all on the same page. As new heroes are released, the roster of legal heroes increases. As heroes reach Living Legend, it decreases. If, such as in 2024, the number of heroes far exceeds the number of heroes leaving, then the hero roster will get significantly larger. Roster bloat reflects an increasing number of heroes legal within the format. Regardless of how meta a hero is, or isn't, they need to be prepped for. And as the list of viable heroes increases, it becomes not only harder and harder for players to account for and tech for what they might face, but perhaps more importantly, harder and harder for the developers at LSS to balance the game. As Flesh and Blood players pick up and learn new heroes, there is an inherent expectation that those heroes will be legal for a fair amount of time. From both a time investment and a monetary investment, having heroes rocket through the Living Legend board is a major risk to Fab product health and player sentiment. Velocity, which we will use transposable with hero lifespan, is a measure of how fast a hero earns those Living Legend points, which of course directly translate to how long they are legal within the main constructed formats. And last, we have steady state, a concept in science, engineering, and business that effectively says what goes in must come out, lest we get accumulation or depletion. As applied to Fab's Living Legend system, this means that the number of new heroes roughly matches the number of heroes leaving, and that the number of Living Legend points available each season is correct for the size of the hero pool. Unbalanced heroes in either direction, good or bad, disrupt this delicate balance, grabbing either greater share of points and LLing too quickly, or, inversely, acting as dead weight with their associated points injection. Now, in an ideal and sustainable environment, these three concepts would be in balance. The roster would remain roughly the same size, and heroes would be legal for the correct amount of time, both due to their win rates and the correct number of injected Living Legend points. So with us baselined on the definitions and those general concepts understood, let's start peeling back the onion, so to speak, on the impacts of those variables to the Living Legend system. The most straightforward one to wrap our heads around is that of bloat. 2024 saw the addition of 13 heroes added to the classic constructed hero pool. 5 from heavy hitters, 3 from Mistveil, 4 from Rosetta, and of course Aria to drop shortly after PQ season at Worlds. It's worth noting that, yes, Jarl Vitradey will also be a technical 2024 hero. However, given that his release is after the vast bulk of the 2024 competitive seasons have wrapped up, it's actually more fair to consider him functionally a 2025 hero, which I will be doing for the purpose of this discussion. What's more is that only one hero reached Living Legend during this year so far, Dromai, which means that the CC hero roster jumped from 20 at the end of 2023 to a whopping 31 and soon to be 33 with Scarlet Aira and Jarl Vitradey before year end. That is a greater than 50% increase in the hero pool. Now, we of course expect the hero pool to ebb and flow over time. By no means does the addition of a new hero have to correlate with the immediate expulsion of another. But by and large, unless the number of LO points injected roughly matches the demand put forth by added heroes, we will observe bloat. And, as you've already gotten there because the math is easy, that's right, the 13x 2024 heroes would represent a steady state need of roughly 13,000 points. That is in stark contrast to the Living Legend points that have been added during the year so far. As of right now, just over 7,500 points have been accumulated, with another 300 on the table for Worlds and a handful of callings and battle hardens still in the chamber. Now, to be fair, one can certainly argue whether that is a problem statement or not, given their own point of view. And certainly, not all of these heroes for sure are competitively viable in the current meta and with the current pool. No one here is denying that, but one can see that this gap, currently over 5,000 points, is quite significant and results in a permanent increase to the roster. Now let's flip to the other side of the balance beam and look at hero velocity. To begin this discussion, let's first look at LSS's philosophy and approach regarding hero velocity. In a 2022 article by James White himself, written of course, as we've come to expect, extremely well and with great transparency, he outlines changes being made at the time to shore up the LL program. In that article, one of the primary concerns he addresses is that of hero lifespan. In other words, how long they would expect a hero to be legal. He writes, "What do we think a good lifespan looks like? Ideally 15 to 20 months from release for a high-performing hero in Classic Constructed." They also included a table showing the corresponding hero win rates that would be in line with those expectations. Now, while the table they used was based on an annual injection of 3,000 Living Legend points, which is of course a very different situation in 2024 than it was in 2022 when the article was written, it does let us baseline that LSS considers an acceptable hero win rate to be in the 20 to 25% range.
The other piece, which I think is actually a bigger issue, is just the way that the Living Legend points were calibrated. Zen was the best deck in the format, undisputably. But he was best deck in format at about a 30% win rate. And that's like really quite normal, or certainly within the bounds of normality or reasonableness for a best deck in the format. So best deck in the format wins 30% of the events. Okay, nothing strange there. LLs in one season, LLs in 2 weeks, in fact. Like, that's the bigger issue.
Yeah.
And
so that video excerpt that we just watched was from a recent dev talk on Flesh and Blood's YouTube channel, and in that context, James and Brian were discussing Zen's performance during Skirmish Season 9. And as you heard James say, he didn't think that a 30% win rate was all that unreasonable. While certainly high, yes, but not unreasonable. So given that, it seems fair to assume that their target for a well-performing hero remains at that approximate win rate. But here's where things start getting a little sticky as related to hero velocity. Going off that 15 to 20 month target lifespan and correlating that win rate range and then doing the math, we find that to be extremely limiting. Assuming a midpoint of 18 months and even utilizing the low end of the win rate range, we see that the theoretical limit of LL points injection is around 3,300 per year. In other words, exceeding that rate of points added will mean that we should expect our well-performing heroes to L out far before that 15 to 20 month lifespan. So with all of that understood, it becomes quite clear what our problem statement is. The math around velocity and the math around bloat, they don't balance. A prime example of this case was seen during the most recent Blitz season, Skirmish Season 9, when it came to Zen. Over the first 2 weeks of that season, Zen displayed a 30% win rate to ascend at the fastest pace in Blitz history. Now, while this 30% was higher than, of course, the 20% that we were referencing here, recall that it was pretty in line with what James said he was okay with. Therefore, the conclusion can only be that there were just too many points available during the skirmish. But then, of course, we have the other side of the coin. With 15 new legal Blitz heroes introduced during 2024, the bloat balance would need to be 7,500 points. And in fact, Skirmish 9 only had 2,250 points up for grabs, less than a third of that. Now, granted, the Zen situation is more unique to Blitz, given that the majority of the format's LL points come in massive spikes during Skirmish season. So sure, it's not exactly one-to-one to Classic Constructed, but the basic concept does still hold. The only way of truly preventing excessively low hero lifespans is to limit the LL points to approximately 3,300 in that point range for Classic Constructed. But of course, at Flesh and Blood's current rate of 3 draftable sets per year, that correlates to a minimum of 9 to 12 new heroes per year. Now, as we've seen with sets like both Outsiders and Heavy Hitters, not all of these heroes needs to be new in order for the set to work. That said, limiting an injection to only 3 to 4 mechanically brand new heroes within a year seems pretty unreasonable given the current environment and expectation of Flesh and Blood players, both competitively and even from a business standpoint. And returning back to our seesaw example, we clearly see that the protection of hero velocity directly results in roster bloat, and protecting roster bloat will only result in heroes accelerating through the system faster. So with all these data points and cases understood, we can see the net problem statement with Living Legends system balance. With the expectation that a good performing hero is legal for roughly 18 months, it becomes functionally impossible to simultaneously balance both roster bloat and hero velocity. LSS is good, incredibly innovative, but even they can't dodge the realities of this math. So that is our problem statement at hand, folks. And I do feel it's important to point out that while yes, 2024 certainly highlighted this problem due to the massive number of added heroes, as I've demonstrated here, 2024 isn't actually the root cause, so to speak. It was just an extreme case that highlighted the vulnerability. So let's go ahead and move forward into solution space, assuming of course that this is solvable. The challenges in front of us are follows. Hero velocity dictates a cap of roughly 3,300 points per year. Roster bloat demands an injection of 1,000 points per hero. And to maintain hero lifespan within the LSS-defined acceptable range, this limits us to 3 to 4 heroes per year. It is functionally impossible to maintain this balance given the realities of a healthy competitive meta and the needs of a sustainable TCG product. Therefore, the options available to LSS are somewhat limited. As I see them, LSS must either become comfortable with hero lifespans that are less than their existing 18-month target, accept that hero bloat will accrue at a rate of roughly 6 to 9 per year forever, or decrease the number of new heroes released each year. Each of these, of course, has its own pitfalls, and many are probably not realistic given the constraints of Flesh and Blood. The first option is perhaps the most volatile and risky, although to be fair, this is already in jeopardy given the current points injection rate. As we saw in Heavy Hitters, players were very dissatisfied with the rate at which Kayo gained Living Legend points, but then we move to Mistveil and look at Zen. If Mist season had been the same number of points as Heavy was, Zen would have LL'd within that single season. But in terms of player satisfaction, allowing heroes to LL out within a matter of months would be largely unacceptable as a general practice. Regardless of where you may personally fall on the rotation versus no rotation scale, it is undeniable that moving to a structure where heroes are leaving with a duration of probably even like a year would fundamentally shake Fab to its core. Thus, we can come to the conclusion that this isn't really a viable option. The second option is essentially throwing bloat out the window. Now, this is one that some players would automatically say, well, it doesn't really matter, it's only a few more heroes. But again, we're trying to look at the macro picture here. Over the next 5 years of Flesh and Blood, a net injection of 6 to 9 heroes per year lands us into the 70 to 80 legal hero range by year 10. That's assuming, of course, 3 to 4 LL heroes per year, remember our 3,300 point target, and the introduction of 3 to 4 heroes on a 3 set per year cadence. And I personally see this as a massive risk, not as much from the displeasure of the top tier folks, as I still suspect the meta would be probably relatively well defined as heroes rise to the top. Rather though, I think the real risk is the challenge presented to the dev team of trying to design and balance with such a large number of variables. Now, the third option, as I see it, is perhaps the most obvious. LSS can decrease the number of new heroes released each year. Now, that as an outward statement certainly will not work. After all, we have to have a certain number of heroes for each draftable set, and we need to continue to innovate to drive sales and prevent staleness. However, I argue that LSS not only can, but should, utilize reentrant heroes such as heavy hitters Rhinar to offset and ensure Limited is still supported. This was extremely successful in Outsiders, 6 playable heroes in Limited format while only introducing 2 new heroes to the CC format and 3 into Blitz. While they likely wouldn't want to do sets that are completely reused heroes, using them supplementally makes a whole lot of sense and really helps on both the bloat and velocity fronts. So as I see it, those are the main levers at LSS's disposal to help them eat into this problem statement that I've outlined here today. Sure, it won't solve it outright, but it can certainly help to muffle the impacts and smooth out the edge cases. Now, as we wrap this up, I'd like to offer a few proposals that I believe LSS can utilize going forward. None of these are complete solutions, but implemented together I believe can greatly mitigate both bloat and the risk of overinjection of points. First, as I implied earlier, I believe that LSS should strive to utilize re-entrant heroes such as in Heavy and Outsiders at an approximate 33 to 40% rate. This ensures Limited is still solidly supported, but it decreases the rate of mechanically new heroes added to the roster. Now, note that my numbers here are loosely based on a mix of 3 hero and 4 hero sets, and would of course need to be higher if we get more larger sets like Heavy, or if we get multiple 4 hero sets, or if they increase the set rate, or so on. My next point might be more or less well received, but I believe LSS should consider re-implementation of the supplemental set model, albeit at a much lower rate than previously. In combination with the change above, I estimate that this would only need to be roughly 1 out of every 5 sets. Now, of course, we've seen how well some subsets have performed in the past, so it needs to be carefully considered along with LSS's business goals that this would impact sales and collectability negatively. Finally, and the one that I think isn't going to get a lot of complaints, is that LSS should strive to aggressively upskill via expansion slot or armory decks our underperforming heroes. This results in point sharing on the already full roster, utilizing inventory to artificially delay hero throughput. This itself doesn't correct the problem statement at all, but it does help to buy us time. And the reason that this one is so easy is because LSS already has the framework in place for this and has been doing it already to a certain extent. The potential drawback, of course, is the difficulty in testing. One big bomb could completely break a hero. However, ask yourself, won't they have the same difficulty testing successfully when we have a 70 hero card pool? Now, note that nothing here in my proposals has to do with mechanically balancing heroes or anything of the sort. An overpowered hero like Zen or someone else would still run the risk of speedrunning just as it does today. That said, I feel strongly that considering and implementing some, if not all of these proposals would have a positive overall impact. So my friends, hopefully you view this discussion as having been value added. And again, please remember, this all comes from a place of wanting the game to succeed indefinitely. And with what we saw this year and the impacts to the Living Legends system, it's clear to me that if we continue on the current course, the Living Legends system will break at some point in the near future. So let me know, what do you think? Do you agree this is right? Do you think it's a problem or not? And more importantly, what are your ideas? As you know, I really value these type of discussions and I appreciate the intelligent discourse around them. So thanks for joining me, and of course, go Commando.